Yeah, it's good to have you with us this evening, and hope that our study will be something that will help all of us to have a better understanding, a clearer understanding of the Scriptures. Tonight, we're going to be starting with Acts chapter 9 and verse 32, and we remember that verse 31 ended with Paul. Now it's going to go away from Paul for a little while, and it's going to look at some things that occurred with Peter. And so in verse 32 and 33 it says, "And it came to pass, as Peter passed throughout all quarters, he came down also to the saints which dwelt at Lydia. And there he found a certain man named Aeneas, which had kept his bed 8 years and was sick of the palsy." So the text is now going to focus on Peter's evangelistic work. And notice that it says he passed throughout all quarters. In other words, his efforts were widespread. It wasn't just in Judea. It wasn't just in Jerusalem, where we find him quite often, but other quarters of or other areas in the land. And he came down also to the saints which dwelt at Lydia. Now, notice that it says the saints dwelt at Lydia. In other words, these were not people who were passing through or were just there for the summer or vacation or something of that nature. And notice that he did not go to the cemetery. That's not where he went. He went to the people, those who were living. And Lydia, if we remember by your map of that area of the world, is 10 or 12 miles southeast of Joppa. And those two places, Joppa and Lydia, were both very important places in that time. Now, one of the saints who he comes in contact with is named for us. His name is Aeneas. And Aeneas, he finds him in bed, not because he was lazy, not because he was tired all the time, but because he had had a problem for 8 years. And this problem was called palsy. The New American Standard and the New King James Version said that he was paralyzed. Aeneas did not do a miracle. He didn't have a miracle worked on him. It's interesting that when miracles were done, it was never done in any case that is in the Scriptures by a person for himself. It was always for somebody else. If they had been able to, then what would Paul have done? Didn't he have a thorn in the flesh? Whatever that thorn was, whether it was physical, whether it was an eye, back, or whatever it may be. He didn't perform a miracle. He had the ability to perform miracles, but he couldn't do one on himself. How he got this way is not known. We don't know if he had an accident. We don't know if it was a disease. We don't know if it was some kind of an injury from war. We don't know what it was. All we know is that he was apparently paralyzed. In verse 34 and 35, Peter said unto him, "Aeneas, Jesus Christ maketh thee whole. Arise and make thy bed." And he arose immediately, and all that dwelt at Lydia and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. Now, there's no indication that Aeneas asked Peter for anything, spoke to him at all. We have no idea what took place before Peter said, "Aeneas, Jesus Christ makes you whole." So when he talks about this, Peter didn't say, "I make thee whole." Notice that. There's never an indication where an apostle or one of the inspired men ever said that he did something in and of himself. There's no taking credit for themselves for what God did. I would suggest that would be a very dangerous thing to do, to take credit for something that God did without mentioning him in some way. He gave total glory to Jesus. Jesus Christ, Savior, Messiah, maketh thee whole. And notice that this implied that Jesus was alive. He's working. He's doing something on behalf of his Father. What did he do? He made this man whole. And that's an implication that he's alive. If he wasn't alive, he couldn't have done or made this man whole. And then he says, arise and make thy bed. And he arose immediately. Now, there are several things involved in this. He had been this way for 8 years. I remember years ago having knee surgery, very serious knee surgery. And after they put me in the cast and after they were able to take the cast off, I could not lift 2.5 pounds with my leg. Couldn't lift 2.5 pounds. Now, I was an athlete, and this was just really weird. You know, I was used to being able to pick up with one leg 50 pounds on the weight machine. Now I couldn't even lift 2.5 pounds. And it took a year of therapy, and even really beyond that, working the leg and more until finally I was able to kind of walk right. Imagine a man who's been paralyzed for 8 years. There would be absolutely no use of his leg at all. None at all. So Paul tells him, or Peter rather, tells him, make thy bed. This healing was immediate. He didn't have to work at therapy for months and months and try to get his leg back to where the muscles would react and work and the ligaments would all work together. It was done immediately. He didn't have to do what fake healers today. Peter didn't. You know, today, fake healers, they want us to wait a couple of weeks and hope the person got well, and so they could go over and brag, and a lot of it is psychosomatic. It's not really a disease or sickness, and I can't help but remember a man named Ernest Angley. Any of you remember Ernest Angley? Yeah. That guy was something else. I watched him a couple of times just to see the things that he was doing. And he was hilarious, sadly hilarious, but he was hilarious. And I watched him in his gold room, in the building where he is. The walls were painted, or not painted, but they were covered with the gold like you'd find on the Capitol building. And he's going to heal this man. And the man was deaf in one ear. Yeah, I think you probably already know where this is going. The guy was deaf in one ear, and he got him up there on a stage, and he got on the side which was deaf, and he says, "Can you hear me?" The guy didn't react. And so he went through his little rigmarole and everything, and finally he went around the other side, and he says, "Can you hear me?" Well, obviously the guy could hear. He had one good ear. And everybody goes, "Oh," and they all went nuts. Well, Peter wasn't like that. When he healed someone, when Jesus healed someone, when any of those who were given the ability to heal someone healed someone, they were healed immediately. Now, making his bed is going to prove that he was healed. How? Well, he's got to get up, first of all, off the bed, right? Now remember, their bed was more like what we would call a pallet. I've slept on those many a time, not just when I was in the military, but also in the Far East, where it's just basically a little pallet, real thin, and you sleep on it. It's kind of like sleeping on the ground. But you make your bed, so he had to get up. Then he had to be able to roll it and move along with his body till he got it all rolled up, as the way they did in those times. stick it under his arm, and go on his way. More than likely, I would suggest that this was very much like the man that we saw earlier in Acts, where the apostles healed him, or we could look at the one where Jesus healed a man, and maybe that's a little better one, where they let him down on his bed, his pallet, into the midst of Jesus when he was in that room because they couldn't get in any other way, tore up the roof, let him in, and he did this. I would almost be willing to say that this man had been carried somewhere, like the man in Acts, and then Jesus or Peter healed him and had him take up his bed, and so we went home with it. What were the results of this miracle? Well, everyone in Lydia and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord. Look at that. Aeneas may have been very well known. It's very possible that he was well known, or maybe this was done in such a public manner that everybody was talking about it, but the word spread. And his condition would have been well known as well. They saw him. They saw him for 8 years in this condition. Usually when someone was in that position, in order to be cared for, he had to be able to beg. So he would be carried somewhere, and that's why I think that he probably was. And again, remember, that's my opinion. The people turned to the Lord. They became Christians. Isn't that interesting? Something like that is seen, and now all of a sudden, people are saying, yeah, but I'm going to suggest something else here. I'm going to suggest that they had been taught by Peter. They had heard about the gospel from those who had been converted in Jerusalem, and as they spread throughout the regions, they would have heard about it. A person would not just say, oh, I'm a believer now because I saw a miracle. There's got to be some teaching involved for them to literally turn to the Lord. Look at Mark 16, 17 through 20. Jesus is getting ready to go back home, and he's talking to his apostles, and he tells them, these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out demons. The word devils is unfortunate. It means demons. They shall speak with new tongues. Well, what's a new tongue? It's not some gibberish that somebody has made up and wants to try and impress people with. It's a language that they had never spoken before. A new language, we might say, to them. They shall take up serpents. You hear about people now. I remember a comedian named Jerry Clower, and he talked one time about going to some church meeting, and he said they got the snakes out, and he just asked one of them, where do you want a new door? And he's going to run through the wall. Well, that's not what took place here. Usually those serpents in those kinds of situations that Jerry Clower got himself into were defanged, or their poison sacs had been taken out. Now, occasionally you will hear of somebody dying who believes he can handle snakes, and it doesn't matter if they bit him or they ain't going to kill him. And something that's very little known by most people, many times when a rattlesnake bites you, he doesn't empty any venom in you. They have a way of controlling it. And if it's a surprise, then maybe you're going to get it. But a lot of times poisonous snakes, if they bite somebody, don't necessarily inject any poison into them. But be that as it may, they're going to be able to take up his apostles and those whom they are given or whom they give the ability to perform miracles Won't hurt them. A good example of that will be seen later in the book of Acts with Paul. He's shipwrecked on an island. He's helping the people as he always was, being willing to help out. He wasn't above getting his hands dirty, and so he gathered sticks, and when he put them on the fire, this viper came out and bit him, and the language shows that it hung on. Now, when a snake hangs onto you, this poison, you're going to get some venom. If they just strike you in a way, good chance you won't. But it hung on to him. That's what the language shows. And guess what? All the people who saw this thought, yeah, he's going to start swelling up and he's going to die. And then when he didn't die, they thought, uh-oh, he's a god. Look how they changed the focus of their thinking just almost immediately. And if they drink any deadly thing, I remember one of my teachers telling us about an incident when he was a younger preacher, and he and another preacher went to this meeting where this guy claimed to be able to do exactly the things that are mentioned in this passage, named them off. And so he said, okay, I'm going to silence this guy. And he had a little vial, it had water in it. And he went up and he said, now, this is poison. And he said, now, you sign this thing saying you don't hold me responsible, and you drink it, and we'll see if you die. Well, the guy wouldn't do it. Well, why? Because he knew he couldn't do it. He knew that he couldn't drink some deadly thing and it wouldn't hurt him. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. What did Peter just do as we were looking at it? We don't know if he actually laid his hands on him. More than likely he did, because that's the way our Lord mentioned this. But we also know that times took place where people were healed where Jesus wasn't even there. He was a distance away. Remember the centurion's daughter, or that Roman official's daughter? He wasn't even there. He healed her from a distance. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. So then after the Lord had spoken unto them, he was received up into heaven and sat on the right hand of God, watching. And they went forth and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them. Who's working with him? The Lord. In other cases, we see it's Spirit working with them. It's still deity. It's still God. And confirming the word. What word? The lessons they taught to people, the scriptures, with signs following. That's why I believe that these people were taught, and then when this man was healed that was paralyzed, they began turning to the scriptures, because now they had the proof that what they said, what Peter said, was from God. And how was it proved? With signs following, miracles. The apostles never used miracles to amass a following for themselves. They weren't in it for themselves. I'm studying right now and writing a commentary on the book of Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians. And part of what I'm looking at in there is Paul and Silas and Timothy obviously have been charged by somebody as being in it for themselves, in it for what they could get from the Thessalonians. And he's calling the Thessalonians, and by the way, and God as his witness, twice in verse 5 and verse 10 of chapter 2. He calls them as his witness of how they behaved themselves while they were among them. And that he charges them to remember how he and Silas and Timothy had acted. Obviously, they worked themselves day and night, the text says. What were they doing? They were working day and night. In doing what? Well, he was a tent maker, so probably making tents, and in teaching the gospel. And he asked for nothing from them. What an interesting thing. He used them to, he did not use them to, the miracles to get people to believe and obey God's word in essence. The teaching is sufficient to do that. But by using the miracles, then he proved that God was with him. And so I guess in that sense, you could say that they were used to a certain extent to get people to believe. And they always attributed what they did to Jesus, to the Spirit, or to God. Deity could only do these things. No man by himself could do it. Today we see these people talk about they're going to have a healing service. It's such a shame that so many people are so gullible that they will accept this kind of stuff. In verse 36 it says, now there was at Joppa, remember we talked about this, he's about 10 to 11, 12 miles away at this time. There was at Joppa a certain disciple named Tabitha, which by interpretation is called Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and alms deeds, which she did. We remember that Joppa was about 10 or 12 miles away from Lydia. Well, what happened? Here's a certain disciple, and this woman is named Tabitha. She was a disciple. She was a Christian. She was a saint. All Christians are saints. Now, we sit back and we look around us and we see a particular religion that says a saint is somebody way above everybody else. They're really, and you know, they have to do a certain amount of miracles and all this stuff, and then we'll call them a saint. We'll in a sense deify them. A disciple, a Christian, we're all saints as Christians. Now, do we always act like a saint? No. Nobody says we're perfect. That doesn't say we're perfect. That doesn't say we're holier than anybody else who is a Christian. It's a term that is used to signify Christians. Tabitha, Dorcas being her Greek name, and her name meant antelope or gazelle. In that time, many times people were named not necessarily immediately after birth, or even names figured out ahead of time, and this is what we're going to name our child, like we do in America most of the time. Many times a name was given to somebody because of some attribute about them or something. The American Indians did this quite often. Maybe he's Brave Hawk. I was trying to remember Joe Gilmore. Old Joe Gilmore. Joe Gilmore, preacher in our brotherhood, you probably heard of him. Joe was a pure blood Jenny, can you remember? No, not Cherokee. Cherokee's enemy. Anyway, I can't remember what he was, but almost at every lectureship that he was at, people would ask him to give the war whoop, and so he would do it. And I remember Joe was kind of interesting. He would give other preachers, after he got to know them a little bit and figure them out a little bit, he would give them Indian names. He would call them Chief so-and-so or Chief this or that. And I can't remember what he called me, but anyway, names given to signify something about a person. You might call someone an eagle. Well, what would an eagle have? Sharp eyes. Can see from huge distances away, a little bitty mouse in a field. Hawks the same way. So when she was named antelope or gazelle, what picture does that bring to our minds? Graceful, wouldn't you think? graceful. You know, you go out and watch deer move. They're just fantastic animals, just amazing in the grace that they show in movement as they're moving along. Robertson says that means the creature with a beautiful look or eyes. Eyes can tell an awful lot about a person. Jenny and I were commenting the other night. We were watching an old rerun of Murder, She Wrote. And this woman on there had the most amazing eyes. And that was before, you know, they put contacts in with really weird stuff and make them look weird. I mean, she had the most amazing, almost scary in a way. But anyway, so they tended to name people by some characteristic about them. Well, how is this disciple then described? Notice that she's not described as a beauty. She's described as a woman who is full of good works and alms deeds. Now, the scriptures teach us that it tells women that they're to dress modestly, in shamefacedness and sobriety. Is there anything wrong with wearing earrings for a woman? Nah, nothing wrong with that. What is wrong is if she does it in such a way that it's so gaudy that it draws attention to themselves. Many people tend to think that being modest deals with wearing enough clothes. Don't wear too little amount of clothes. But the word modest is more inclusive than that. It deals with drawing attention to yourself by the way you act. Do we dress in such a way to purposely draw attention to ourselves? Now that's where, you know, nowadays we see people take all kinds of colors and put them in their hair, and even some 70 and 80-year-old women that think they can look like a teenager again. That's drawing attention to yourself. You do it to draw attention to yourself. A woman who would come in to say the worship services wearing a fur coat and a huge hat with big feathers and everything all over, what's it going to do? It's going to draw everybody's attention to her, and that's exactly what that person wants. The same is true with wearing too little amount of clothes. Both are immodest. We're not to dress in such a way as to draw attention to ourselves. We're supposed to be like Dorcas. And that's for all of us. People who are full of good deeds, alms deeds. Someone who is interested in helping those who maybe are not able to help themselves. Full of, notice, good works. She's full of good works. This isn't a one-time thing. This isn't an occasional thing that she's involved in. She's full of good works. She did good things for people. The word alms deeds comes from a Greek word that means mercy, pity, especially as exhibited in giving alms, charity, a donation to the poor, according to Thayer, his Greek lexicon. So when you look at these two terms that are used to describe this woman, she is full of good works, not just once in a while. She's full of good works, works of mercy, works of pity. So who would she have been making these things for? Obviously, the poor, those who couldn't take care of themselves, who needed help, who needed something to help keep them warm, which she did. The verb tense here is imperfect. And the imperfect verb tense implies that she was in the habit of doing these deeds. Again, not just a one-time thing. She's full of these deeds. And when you look at the verb tense of being imperfect, it's something that is ongoing. It is something that she is doing on a regular basis, deeds of kindness. Bruce translated this passage as she spent all her time in the performance of good works and acts of kindness. And that's, in my opinion, a very good explanation, if you want to call it that, or commentary on this verse. Look at verse 37 and 38. And it came to pass in those days that she was sick and died, whom when they had washed, they laid her in an upper chamber. And forasmuch as Lydia was nigh to Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent unto him 2 men, desiring him that he would not delay to come to them. So Peter's in Lydia. Dorcas is in Joppa. Thank you. Peter's in Lydia. Dorcas is in Joppa. And the brethren in Joppa heard that Peter, they didn't have telephones then. How'd they hear? How'd they know? They could send messages in amazing ways and cover a lot of territory. My suggestion would be Peter had probably been there for a little while. You know, a lot of times when we read things in the Bible, it's almost like, okay, it happened, bing, 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 but it doesn't always do that. There's a good chance that Peter had been there for a while, and word had traveled, and they knew in Lydia that he was there, or in Joppa rather. And so Tabitha was prepared for burial and placed in an upper room. Now, in those times, and just like in this day and time, if hospice is called in our day and time, when one dies, you call the person who was taking care of your loved one. They come and they wash the body, just like they did in those times. Now, in our time, we go through more than that. We then send them to the I'm having trouble. The funeral home, and there they're prepared even further, and then put out in honorarium or in a way for people to come and pay their last respects. So apparently, for a very short time, they had put her in this upper room after they had prepared her for burial. Now, normally in that part of the world, because of the heat that's involved and temperatures, they're buried quite quickly before all of this idea of preparing somebody by taking them to the funeral home. But they didn't do that back in that time. Now, the Egyptians, they were mummifying people. I've often wondered about that, but you know, we still don't really know the whole process for them doing that. But however it was done, it was done. So why did they send for Peter? She's dead. I would suggest that they'd obviously heard about what Peter could do, what the apostles had probably already done in other places, what Jesus had done, and that he had given them power. So why did they send for Peter? Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. Freely ye have received, freely give. Now, when we look at that in Matthew 10 and verse 8, we realize that he was speaking to his apostles when he sent them out on what we call the limited commission. And he told them, when you go out on this limited commission, you heal the sick and you cleanse these lepers. Unheard of. Cleansing of lepers. Raise the dead. You cast out demons. But notice what was said at the end of that statement by Jesus. Freely ye have received, freely give. He expected them to use those abilities that he had given them to help other people. Obviously, it can't be done today. No apostle has been alive for a long, long time, and it takes the apostles' hands laying on someone else in order to give them the ability to do those things. So you see, the apostles could do it, and those whom they laid their hands on and imparted special abilities had special abilities to heal people, cast out demons, verify the truth, all of that list of things we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. But he was speaking to the apostles. You freely received, freely give. And I believe that would have included what they did later. Simon the sorcerer, remember, he wanted to pay for the ability to do what Peter did in giving people miraculous abilities. Obviously, people were freely given those abilities. So in verse 39, Peter arose and went with them. These messengers had come down. They tell him about Tabitha. When he was come, they brought him into the upper chamber, the upper room, and all the widows stood by him weeping and showing the coats and garments which Dorcas made while she was with them. Now we're getting a little more detail. First of all, we see the word coats. It comes from the Greek word chiton, meaning tunic or inner garments. We think of a coat as putting on an overcoat or something like that, or it's cold outside and let me go get a coat and put on over the rest of my garments to help try and keep me warm. But this original word shows that this was an inner garment, a tunic, so to speak. In this day and time, we would call it underwear. So she made those for them, but she also made garments, and the Greek word here is hematian, outer wear. So she made both inner wear and outer wear for these widows when they apparently could not afford to buy it or couldn't make it for themselves. Dorcas had been very generous with her time and her talents. She obviously had a talent. We don't know where she got the funds to be able to do this. You know, my dad used to make toys after he retired from General Motors, and specifically he was more interested in making toys to give to children. And he did work in giving toys at nursing homes where maybe somebody in going back, as we do in our old age sometimes, going back to be a little childish. He thought that if they would enjoy something like that, or if they showed an interest in it, he'd give them one. He did it for other organizations too, that he'd give them toys. And what he did was try to make enough to sell to give the toys. And when people started finding out what was going on, they started bringing him wood from houses that were being built where they'd have scrap pieces of wood. They'd bring him wood so that he could use it to make the toys for the kids. And I happened to be able to go and see one young man. He was in his middle 20s, but he was unable to do almost anything. I mean, he could walk around. And he had one of these toys that Dad had made on a string, and he's pulling it down the hall just as happy as can be. Dorcas was very generous. We don't know how she got the materials to make these things, but with her time and her talents. And obviously Tabitha would be greatly missed by these widows. Notice they were all gathered around Peter, and they're showing him all of these garments that she had made for them. Will I be missed for the same kind of reasons that she was missed? Will you be missed? I think sometimes we need to ask ourselves, how do people see us? Do they see us as kind and benevolent? Do they see us as willing to sacrifice time and energy on their behalf? This is also something that's pointed out in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, that Paul calls them as his witnesses along with God to be his witness of how he behaved himself, the way he lived while he was among them. Let's come back next week to verse 40, beginning in our study. I hope that this study tonight has been beneficial to everyone, and I hope that you have a great week ahead of you.